Often considered to be the greatest work of Alan Moore, an English comic book writer, also famous for such works as V for Vendetta and From Hell, Watchmen was a 12-part comic book series which ran from 1986 to 1987.
Rights for a film adaptation of this highly popular book were acquired in 1986, but it wasn't until 23 years later that the film made it onto the big screen.
Helmed by Zack Snyder, the man behind 300, Sucker Punch and the upcoming Superman reboot, Watchmen was released in 2009 to a wave of hype.
And we here at Standard Definition were swept up in it like so many others. I myself have been nurturing a growing love for graphic novels for quite some time, but had only heard of The Watchmen in passing. That was until this beautifully crafted trailer appeared.
The film was unavoidable on the run-up to its release. The marketing machine going into overdrive with TV spots, excessive trailer coverage in cinemas and online, a tie-in video game, several viral campaigns, so on and so on.
I specifically remember walking into a certain chain of bookshops and being greeted to a sea of yellow book covers, much like this.
But to be fair, it likely needed the marketing clout behind it, because individually, The Watchmen's ingredients a hit film did not make.
But more about that later. Much later. Like part 2 later. Part 2 later.
Something we'd like to focus on in this review is the nature of adaptations.
This film is really closely adapted from the source material.
With a few exceptions.
So take it as read that unless we state otherwise, any point we make about the film, we're also making about the graphic novel. Yeah? Glad you're on board.
So with that in mind, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the somewhat busy story.
Go, George! Go! Go!
At its core, Watchmen is about a group of has-been superheroes longing for the glory days of crime fighting after a piece of legislation known as the Keene Act banned costume vigilantism a few years previously.
Several of the characters have continued their work under government sanction, however, either as political assassins or military deterrents, changing the course of history as we know it.
The story being set in an alternative 1980s, in which the political and technological landscape of the world has been affected by one man, Alan Moore's take on a Superman-esque being.
But Dr. Manhattan, as he's known, doesn't enter the tale quite yet, the narrative beginning with more humble events, that being the murder of the comedian, a member of the disbanded Watchmen.
The murder is investigated by stinky crime fighter Rorschach, being the only character to still be operating in his former capacity. You know, illegally.
Rorschach, in essence, is the central protagonist. His investigation setting off the main chain of events. Sort of.
Because another set of events begins to become unravelled through his delving, and it soon becomes clear that something far more nefarious is afoot behind the scenes.
Man, exactly.
His suspicions that a killer is aiming to do away with the former heroes leads him into contact with some of his old teammates. Love those guys.
Night Owl, the tech specialist of the group, is now out of shape and living a lonely existence, his only friend being an elderly man named Hollis Mason.
Oh, don't get me started on him.
Mason is in fact a former superhero himself, being the original Night Owl and a prominent member of the Minutemen, the vigilante group preceding the Watchmen who operated during the 40s.
Silk Spectre lives with Dr. Manhattan in the Rockefeller Military Research Center, though she has become unhappy with their relationship and frustrated with her position as his girlfriend/keeper.
I don't know what stimulates you anymore.
Laurie is also the daughter of Sally Jupiter, the original Silk Spectre, and another member of the Minutemen.
Ozymandias is the smartest man in the world and one of the only crime fighters to reveal his true identity to the public.
As Adrian Veidt, he runs Veidt Industries, an organisation concerning itself with finding alternative sources of energy, currently working with this big blue guy in an attempt to replicate his power.
Shadows in a fog.
Dr. Manhattan is the only hero to actually have any superpowers.
After a suitably comic booky science accident, John Osterman is, well, he's disintegrated, but he manages to rebuild himself over the following weeks, creeping out his co-workers in the process.
He finally fully reforms as a superhuman being, able to control matter whilst also existing in a quantum universe, no longer perceiving time as we do, but as a non-linear series of events.
Which basically means he views things in a wholly non-human way, whilst also being able to see into his own future.
You want to ask me to go to dinner with you? Like we used to. But you won't. You know I can't. So you'll call Dan. Which is only natural. You deserve the comfort of an old friend.
And I thought I was awkward with women. Back to the story. Evidence of a plot against our former heroes begins to mount.
Ozymandias thwarts an assassination attempt.
Doc Manhattan exiles himself to Mars after evidence arises that he may cause cancer in the people closest to him.
And Rorschach is framed and imprisoned for the murder of an ex-supervillain.
Throughout this, the story's second act, we get to see key events from each character's backstory, which helps us slowly build a picture of each of them.
He's right, and it's these strong characterizations which are really at the heart of Watchmen.
Come on, baby. I know what you need.
We thought we'd talk about Dan and Laurie first, as their backstories are presented in a slightly different way to the others.
They are the only two members of the Watchmen to be reinventions of characters from the original Minutemen, and both have parent-child relationships with their respective mentors.
As we mentioned, Laurie is the biological daughter of Sally Jupiter, the original Silk Spectre. Dan, on the other hand, isn't related to Hollis Mason, but treats him as a father figure.
These relationships are in stark contrast, however. Both live in the shadow of their namesakes, but where Laurie's relationship with her mother is strained,
Mother, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Dan and Hollis are shown to be close friends.
Which, unfortunately, comes back to bite Dan in the ass later, at least in the book and the director's cut anyway.
Laurie doesn't hate her mother, but she's struggling to come to terms with Sally's love of all things superhero.
This being the woman who pretty much forced her daughter to take over as the new Silk Spectre.
You got it, Jack. And she has a frustratingly overwhelming love for the golden ages of her youth.
Even the grimy parts of it keep on getting brighter.
These two Watchmen eventually come together to form a relationship, demonstrated by this scene of extreme porking.
But it does make sense to them at least. Their histories are pretty similar, and both of them have been left floundering after the instigation of the Keene Act.
They're also used to explore an interesting reading into the nature of costumed heroes. The kinky shit.
Their first sex scene is thwarted by Dan's inability to get it up, but when they get their costumes back on, everything changes.
The idea of comic book characters getting their jollies from running around in latex is one that we've heard before, but never has it been so overtly represented as in The Watchmen.
Dan and Laurie are definitely the most relatable characters. Youngish lovers struggling to reclaim a sense of empowerment in a world that is rapidly going to hell around them.
The following characters, however, are used in different ways, as caricatures of various sentiments and ideals.
The comedian is an ultra-nihilist, kinda like this.
No reason. I just like doing things like that.
But more like this.
His name is obviously a reference to this, the idea being that he finds the entirety of human existence to be without purpose.
Everything mankind can do or say will eventually come to naught. This is especially relevant in the face of a nuclear Armageddon.
He sees it all as one big joke and considers himself to be one of the few who are aware of it, meaning his actions are often questionable from a moral standpoint.
But oddly, he is far from a hateable character. In fact, it's he who discovers the plot to destroy the Watchmen, a revelation which causes him to break down and weep in front of an old foe, as well as being his downfall.
And forevermore, that's how you stay.
And, perhaps in one of the biggest twists of the tale, it is shown that he is genuinely loved.
Not only by the turnout for his funeral, hardly the expected reception for a war criminal,
but with the revelation that he and Sally Jupiter eventually became lovers, despite his attempted rape of her.
The comedian is perhaps one of the most interesting characters, intriguing seeing as his death occurs before the start of the story.
He initially comes off as jaded and wholly unpleasant, but turns out to have the most in-depth insights into the roles of costumed heroes.
Watchmen. That's the real joke. Didn't work 15 years ago, sure as hell ain't gonna work now just because you want to keep playing cowboys and Indians.
The next character on our list may not have the same intelligence or worldly understanding, but damn does he have one hell of a cool mask. Rorschach.
Tell me, what do you see?
Of all characters, it is Rorschach who is most consumed by the notion of black and white justice. There's a right and a wrong, and woe betide anyone whose actions cross into the latter.
Despite his harsh nature, he too displays good qualities, concerning himself with warning his friends of potential danger and showing the depth of his emotions both through his journal and in person.
October 12th, 1985. Dog carcass in alley this morning.
In a way, he's the closest thing the story has to a hero, even though he's a full-on right-wing bastard and clearly quite unstable. It can't be denied that he punishes only the morally unjust.
He's also the most consistent element of the overall narrative, his journal being the primary frame device, both opening and ending the tale.
Of all the Watchmen, he's the only one without a character arc, remaining as steadfast and true to his morals and perspectives from beginning to end, where everyone else around him is forced to reconsider their positions at various points, most notably the ending.
Oh, that ending, man. Sheesh. Shish kebabs.
Alan Moore has stated that he intended Rorschach to be an interpretation of a real-life Batman, a driven and vengeance-fueled vigilante.
And it's this which we think makes him one of history's most interesting and honest comic book characters.
Because, let's face it, it does take a bit of a psychopathic element to run around all night brutally wasting petty criminals. Next.
Ozymandias.
Ozymandias is a walking god complex, stating that the only other human being he's ever felt any kinship towards is Alexander the Great.
But to discuss him in more detail, we'd have to talk about the ending.
Oh, that ending!
Dr. Manhattan is my favourite character. Just saying.
His story is one of loneliness, as he finds himself slipping away from humanity, slowly losing the ability to relate to others and their concerns. Feel that, bro.
I said, leave me alone!
His morals are also shown to be somewhat skewed. He leaves his long-term girlfriend as she gets too old, and commits many a heinous act on behalf of the government, killing and maiming without emotion.
But of course, emotion is now something he's devoid of. Almost. The most interesting facet of his characterization is that he still clings on to elements of his humanity.
He clearly loves and respects Laurie.
His childhood desire to be a watchmaker like his father is still important to him, as he builds a giant timepiece on Mars.
And he ultimately opts to return to Earth in an effort to save humanity from the suspected nuclear holocaust bearing down upon them.
Now dry your eyes. And let's go home.
Despite being that universe's equivalent of Superman, he finds it very difficult to interact with people on a basic level.
It almost comes off as an allegory for Asperger's, a brilliantly intelligent and technically minded individual, practically unable to function in normal society, and he finds himself at his happiest after imposing a self-exile.
We have no idea whether he was written with that intention, it's just something that we got from it personally.
So, that's pretty much the basics, the need-to-know stuff before we get into some of the heavier analysis.
We've still got a lot left to talk about.
We do indeed, George. Expect cries of, that's not how it happened in the book, but not in a way that makes us sound like little bitches.
Oh yeah, we could be brighter with Watchmen, having fun tonight. We are the Watchmen.